Welcome to the Innovation Storytellers Podcast. We talk to innovators and disruptors in R&D, product managers, entrepreneurs, and entrepreneurs, innovation thought leaders, and their storytellers who help bring their amazing ideas to life. Now, here's your host, innovation storyteller, CEO, speaker, and coach to the world's top innovation teams, Susan Lindner.
Hi, I'm Susan Lindner, and for the last 20 years, I've been helping innovators and disruptors to tell their stories. 10 acquisitions and hundreds of innovative products and countless hockey stick growth curves in both directions, and even a couple of new categories along the way. I wanted to share how great innovations get to market using stories to pave the way. I'm super excited today because Mark Olson, who is the Innovation Success Manager at Amazon, is joining me to talk about, well, we're going to talk about a bunch of things. We're going to talk about anthropology because it's very rare that I meet another person who even has the word anthropology in their LinkedIn profile. Naturally, we're going to be talking about innovation and storytelling. But first, let me give you a little bit of background on Mark. So Mark is a unique kind of guy, and why I wanted to have him on, because he combines this tech sector, private sector, and academic sector approach in learning and development, innovation and program management, and even consulting at the Fortune 500 level. Having experience in the private industry, the federal government and the defense industry is very rare in the innovation space. And so with this kind of deep background around emerging technologies in innovation management, in online training, enterprise social networks, and crafting the strategies and programs to support large-scale learning at a place like Amazon is something I think all of us can learn from. And so, Mark, you also have an incredible background in history and anthropology that brings all different kinds of new skill sets to the table that I also think a lot of innovation leaders could learn from. I'm always going to shake the anthropology pom-poms for the team. And so welcome to Innovation Storytellers.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much, Susan. That's a great intro. And I'm trying to figure out who that guy was you just introduced. So it sounds really interesting.
Did I miss anything along the way?
No. It's just my endless quest to find a job. To settle down. So that's how you get to a lot of interesting places, I think.
So I want to go back a little bit to your academic background, because I think I'm always curious about, well, how did you wind up in innovation? And your background around history and anthropology and the military is something really fascinating. Can you share a little bit with our listeners about that background?
Yeah, again, this is a crooked path, right? So I decided at some point that I was going to disappoint my father. And instead of going to get an MBA, I was going to go back to school for what I was really interested in, which was history at the time. And then it became history and anthropology. And so I went to Oregon State for grad school. And so I got dual masters in history and anthropology at Oregon State, which was awesome. Go Beavers. And then moved back to Georgia, which is where I was from. My wife was from there. And I'm trying to figure out what I'm going to do in the year that I'm taking to apply to doctoral programs. And because at that point, I really wanted to be a history professor. And so I'm driving down this street that's about 1.5 miles away from the house we were in. And I saw a sign for a company called New South Associates. And at the bottom, it said archaeologists and historians. I about jammed on the brakes in the middle of a busy street and pulled a U-turn and I had on a t-shirt and cargo short and sandals. Walked right into the front and I said, "Your sign says archaeologists and historians." And the receptionist looked up at me and she's like, "Right." And I said, "I'm both of those things." And she said, "Okay, let me get the owner out here." And so I met Mary Beth and found out the General Services Administration and the federal government are one of the largest single employers of archaeologists and historians in the country.
Why didn't anyone ever tell me that when I was looking for a job?
Well, yeah, let me tell you this. It's not a profit-laden industry. The margins aren't high if they exist. And the reason it exists is because when you disturb federal land, there are regulations that say you either need to establish the archaeological record or the historical record, right? And so they hire people like us to do that. So it could be really interesting. Like I had one job where we relocated the Twin Capitals of the Lower Creek Nation down in Columbus, Georgia. or you could end up doing a phase one survey of a federal highway being widened 1 inch by 100 miles. Probably not super thrilling, but that's the work, and you never know how it's going to come. But so I did that for a year, worked on some really interesting projects, and then got into the history program at American University up in DC, and moved up there and went into my doctoral program in history. And if anybody doesn't know, higher education, especially doctoral programs in liberal arts, have a intake-outtake problem in that they continue to taking graduate students and their jobs just aren't being generated on the other end. And so I started looking at the potential job market and thought I'd actually like to have one of those job things that pays a salary and you can do things like buy cars and stuff with it. And
that's very selfish, by the way. I don't know if
I know
that, but the self-sufficiency really has to stop.
You know what's funny is when I thought I wanted to go to law school and I mentioned it to lawyers, every single person I mentioned it to said, don't go to law school. When I said I was leaving academia for the corporate world, nobody I was in grad school with was like, what are you doing? It's horrible. And so one of the people that I had done field work with, her dad was a retired Army colonel and was working as a defense contractor. And so I said, hey, do you think your dad can just take a look at my resume and give me some pointers on if there was anything, because I'd done work in military history, if there's anything useful in there. 2 weeks later, I walked into the office of the founder of this company, and really intimidating guy, a retired colonel, over 6 feet tall, and sits down, looks at my resume, and he says, so, history. And I said, yes, sir. And he said, so tell me what that painting is on the wall. And I was like, okay. And so I walked over to it and thank the stars, I knew what it was. It was the Red Tails, the Tuskegee Airmen. And I said, it's Tuskegee Airmen. He's like, all right. And I kind of felt like I got through this gate. And so the office I ended up working at was our client was in the Office of Secretary of Defense. There's a shop called the Readiness and Training Policy and Programs Office, and they were responsible for setting training policy across DoD. And I just backed right out of grad school into the Pentagon and stayed there for 5.5 years, working at the OSD level on establishing training policy and looking at emerging technologies for learning and training in both what we call kinetic and non-kinetic environments. What I was really interested in on the anthropology and history side, history was about the confluence of technology and culture, and when we leaped past it. So I looked at things like the Battle of Agincourt, Midway, Wolfpack, Pickett's Charge. Where were those moments when technology leaped past our ability to understand its implications? Mm-hmm. And how did we fail, or how did we succeed in dealing with it? And on the anthropology side, a lot of the same thing, which was I was really interested in cultures of contact, specifically North American, Native Americans, and contact with Europeans, and what those technology interchanges looked like and the impacts they had on both cultures. And so if you pull back one level to a corporate sense, it starts to make sense that the impact of technology on organizations could be, somewhat important to a company, right?
Says the guy who works at Amazon.
Amazon, yeah.
So you and I, prior to starting to record this podcast, we were also talking about an example of that. And I'm just going to geek out on anthropology for 1 minute more if our listeners can handle it. You and I were talking about two things. One example of this, where technology begins to confront culture, right? And I think it's instructive of what you're saying when you go to that next level, at the corporate level. But one of the examples you and I both learned as newbies in anthropology was around cargo cults. And I don't think that a lot of people, they may have heard of them, but don't necessarily make the association. And I want to make that leap between cargo cults and corporate. And so can you share the story around cargo cults so our listeners understand?
In a way, I hope no other anthropologists are listening, because I'm sure that my Reader's Digest version of this will get blasted for being horribly academically incomplete. But
so all anthropologists listening, if you can please put your fingers in your ears and just go moo, 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 moo for the next 3 minutes. We're going to botch this entirely. Go ahead.
So if you think about, though, isolated cultures in say, the Pacific during World War II, and either planes shot down or ships got blown up and things wash up on shore. And if you think about the idea where you could see a culture starting to worship or revere the crate instead of what's in the crate, right? So like the crate came from somewhere else and it's different technology. And so it gets revered. And so instead of unpacking it, we just leave it in the box and revere the box. And I think for me, what that happens in the corporate sense is we fail to unpack the implications of technology and we just revere the technology. That has impact on everything from change management to communications to HR to how we rate and assess people because we're not understanding the implications of the technology. And so that's why Amazon works really hard to avoid that, to avoid thinking that we're worshiping the thing and not the reason we do the thing, right? That's one of my warning signs about, do you actually understand what the implications are that you're doing here versus you're just doing it because it's new tech or it's shiny. That's my kind of long and short on cargo cults.
Yeah. And, we get to a point where we have an expectation of, right? It's not just that the box gets dropped on a beach around a culture that hasn't seen this technology before, right? Mm-hmm. But suddenly we start to emulate that technology. Suddenly we start to worship the technology. Suddenly
we build other crates, empty crates.
That's right. And we begin to see ourselves as being in relationship with the technology that we might not even understand.
Right. And to me, the best exemplar of this is if people haven't watched The Gods Must Be Crazy, which was an amazing movie from like 82. Australian pilot is flying across the bush, throws a Coke bottle out the window of his plane. It lands in the bush village, and this piece of technology came from the sky. They don't have anything like it. It's obviously an object of worship, but then it becomes an object of jealousy and it causes divisions in the tribe and the village. And so the decision is made to take the bottle back to the gods. And so one hapless guy is elected by the village to cross the desert and take the thing back to the city. And to me, it's just always boiled down to any culture not sufficiently prepared to accept a technology will cross a burning desert to get rid of it. And I've seen this time and again with deployments of any kind of enterprise-wide system in a company where you fail to do the change management piece, you fail to do the cultural piece up front, and then your brilliant piece of technology is just utterly rejected by the company or horribly misused. So so everybody should go watch The Gods Must Be Crazy.
That's lesson number one for us armchair anthropologists today.
Right.
But the other piece, we've all been raised, I think, in this tech age that we live in. And I guess there was never a time where tech wasn't part of our lives, but where it is so ubiquitous, we're more apt to leave our child in the backseat of our car than we are our cell phone in our coffee holder, right? So with that thinking in mind, we've all been raised on this idea, in theory at least, of people, process, technology, right? That we have to talk to our people and there has to be a process in place and then the tech should come. But along the way, we think we've gotten so sophisticated, right? That as we innovate, as we begin to create new things, that people and process should just naturally follow. And what you're saying is that where the biggest failure happens, and even the desire to walk across a burning desert to get rid of it will happen, is where when we've thrown out the people in the process and just left us with the tech and fingers crossed it'll all work fine.
Right. So one of the other examples that leaps to mind is when we talk about people, process, and technology, one of the things I think we fail to appreciate is any kind of change we want to introduce operates inside a system. So I hate when I see people talking about, well, we're going to create this company culture. Okay. Your company culture exists. You can be conscious about how you, right. It might be toxic. It might not be what you want, but it exists. So you can't think about, I'm going to create something that's in a vacuum. You have to acknowledge the fact that a culture already exists. If you have more than 2 people working for you, you have a company culture, period. And one of the things that I think about now is when I was in grad school, we wanted to do some online stuff. This was early days, internet. And one of the people who really pushed back was my faculty advisor, who happened to be one of the youngest, most tech savvy people on faculty. And I went to her afterwards and I said, Karen, what's the pushback here? And she said, I have to teach, write, and research. And what you're asking me to do is volunteer. And I also have a family. And so until you change the way I'm rated and assessed, basically your idea can go pound sand. I don't have time for it. And it's not part of how I need to operate. And so I really think now about the foundations that we rest on. So a good example is in learning and development, we're always trying to talk about how to get a seat at the table and how to talk to the C-suite people and how to establish our ROI. And I think one of the reasons that's been really hard is that for the most part, people in organizations are viewed on the balance sheet as liabilities. And you don't invest in liabilities. You invest in assets, We can layer process and technology on top of all this. And at the end of the day, the CFO is going to look at the balance sheet and go, wow, we're paying out a lot in money in salaries, right? And the way I regard that is that's a liability. So if we want to improve company performance, we can decrease the liabilities. So until we look at some of those foundational elements, like how we regard people as part of our organization, like Jeff Bezos is not reflected on the Amazon balance sheet. We have engineers here. Werner Vogels, who's the chief technology officer for AWS, is not reflected on our balance sheet. How do you not reflect that genius on a balance sheet? He's accounted as a liability. He's got a salary and stock, and that's how he's accounted for. So a lot of that holy grail that you talked about, the people, process, and technology, is really impeded from being fully implemented by these foundational elements that are part of the system. It's just like someone said, who invented water? Well, I bet it wasn't fish. Right? So we swim in this stuff so much that it takes such a conscious effort to pull back a layer and see that the system you're embedded in. And it feels like anthropology when you can step in and be the invisible observer and try not to bring your meaning to the scene, but try to understand what's actually going on.
Yeah, it's so fascinating that you say that, because I think to a certain degree, we revere Amazon for a couple of things. One is simply its global might. I remember listening to interviews with Jeff Bezos when he still had hair and wore khakis and light blue button downs. These were different times. But what was always striking is, and I remember from one of his first interviews with Charlie Rose and the desire to name a company Amazon, and his ability to see a diversity of species, i.e. products and services that the company was going to offer, not necessarily knowing what they were, but it certainly wasn't going to stop at books.
You do know what the first name of the company was supposed to be? Abracadabra.
Ah.
And someone dissuaded him from that. Yeah. I think the other little Easter egg I'll give you is if you go to relentless.com, just see where that redirects you. What I think has been unique about Jeff is that he, in a lot of ways, has taken a lot of the romance and emotion out of it. Like the reason he got into the internet, period, was because he saw the astronomical growth in the space. And then his next thought was he didn't get into books because he was a bibliophile. He got into books because it was the easiest point of entry, right? And the unique thing that he really brought along with him was he was going to do all this, but start with the customer. So we weren't just going to say the customer's always right. We were going to obsess about the customer and really focus on being magical, being delightful. Will this delight the customer is a question you hear a lot of times with projects
still
inside Amazon. Yeah. Oh, absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah. And that's culture.
And so I will say this, in a lot of ways, the culture in Amazon is very strong. And here I'm not talking about, I haven't spent time in our FCs at that level on the operational side.
FC.
Fulfillment centers.
Ah, gotcha.
So I'm talking at kind of the Seattle level. We work really hard to maintain the culture and it's very strong. And so we do things that could feel, if you synchronize with it, it's great. And if you don't, it could be really horrible, really fast. And I say that in the sense that we write documents to promote our ideas. We don't do PowerPoint. We write documents. First kind of document you'll write is a PR FAQ, a press release with FAQs. And it's typically written in the future when you're releasing the product that you're proposing. So basically you write a fake press release for the ideal release of your product. And then you write real FAQs about what it takes to get there. And then you take this document into a meeting. And before COVID, you would print out your copies and take it in the meeting and put it down on the table. And then 15 people would pick up red pens and start to just bleed all over your document. And if you can't separate yourself personally from the idea that's being critiqued, that can feel really harsh. If you can, and you can accept that people are trying to make the idea better, or they're trying to assess the idea and figure out its weaknesses and strengths, and it's not you, then that's great. And that feedback feels really rich and nuanced and contextualized, right? And you're like, thank you, I get it now, right? So I will say that obsession on the customer is reflected relentlessly inside the company and how we deal with ideas and how we look at innovations.
So have you been in a meeting with Mr. Bezos when your idea was sitting there as the PR FAQ?
I've been in exactly one meeting with it's called the S team. This is a few years ago. I was running an Enterprisewide
super team and everyone pulls off their shirts with a big S on it, or
SVPs. So Jeff's direct reports. Back then it was Andy Jassy, Jeff Wilkie, people like that, Russ Grandieri. So I was running a enterprise-wide ideation program called Think Big. And we got down to 3 winners from 3,000 ideas, and we took them into the ST meeting so they could present their ideas. There were a couple things that were really striking about it. One was that it ran just like every other Amazon meeting. There was a document to read. We read the document. People made comments. Cool. Worked just exactly like that. So in a way, my idea wasn't on the table because I was running the program, but the program was part of what was being judged there is the viability of bringing ideas up like that. So a couple of things left out from that is I saw, so one of the ideas was a retail idea, and Jeff Wilkie was the CEO of the AWS retail side at that time. And probably one of the people on the face of the planet that has the most perfect knowledge of online retail, right? And this person who'd been at Amazon about 2 years, she was about, 25, 26 years old, cites this number in her pitch. And Jeff, not in a mean-spirited way, just asking a question, says, that number doesn't feel right. I don't think that doesn't feel like the right number. She looked at him and she said, I just spent 2 weeks researching that number. That number's spot on. And I was like, there you go. And he just went, all right. And it was like one of those moments when you're like, okay, that works. And it ties in with one of the last in-person all hands we had, which was in Key Arena before it got renovated. Now it's Climate Pledge Arena, whatever. But 15,000 people. And at the end of it, Jeff always answers questions. And so at the end of this one, somebody got up and went to the microphone and asked Jeff, I'd been there 2 weeks. And he asked him, so what did we learn from the whole Fire Phone thing? And if you don't know, the Fire Phone was about $100 million plus mistake that we made. It was a horrible device. It didn't work well. It didn't delight the customer, that's for sure. And I thought, is it going to be a laser beam? Is it going to be a tank of sharks under the floor that this guy gets dropped into? And Jeff didn't blink. He looked right back at the guy and said, that's a great question. We learned a lot. And he started ticking off like 5 things in detail that made it clear that he wasn't just BSing you. And then he called on Dave Limp, who's the vice president of devices, and says, Dave, what did I leave out? Then in a follow-up interview, he said, look, if we're not making mistakes that make the Fire Phone look like a rounding error, we're not trying hard enough. And I can't tell you from someone who works in innovation how powerful it is to hear your CEO say something like that, that, look, people, I don't want to make the same mistakes, but good gosh, if we're not making new and exciting mistakes, then what are we doing? And so that was really impactful.
Yeah, I almost want to hashtag it. Innovation needs bigger rounding errors, like it's because the fear, right? If, to all of our listeners is that what is the fear factor that's currently inhabiting your innovation space? And is there a possibility for this kind of mindset? If you really want to grow to that exponential level, like in Amazon, can you remove some of the fear factor for your people so that you can actually have a moonshot idea and not get stymied on the launch pad? Because if we're just iterating the launch pad endlessly, we will never get there.
Right. And so I think about this a lot in terms of how we do this. And I think we need to kind of honor the reasons why people up and down the chain are fearful, right? So if I look over at the CFO or whoever's running the budget for the org that I'm in, they're watching numbers. That's their job, and God bless them for it. They're keeping the lights on and keeping the bills paid. And so we need to think about our innovations in a way that what's the most effective, lowest cost way to get to a decision point to either validate or nullify the hypothesis, right? Like pilots don't always have to work. They shouldn't always work, right? But we should probably think of them in modular ways that allow us to get to data points to make better data-driven decisions to go further down the line. I think that's why people get fearful, is because we commit to pilots sometimes that go on for too long, that absorb too much budget, and now it can't fail. It just can't, right? Because that'll look like too much of a black mark on my record. And so we need to look at how we construct pilots, and we need to get the idea firmly planted in people's minds that a perfectly valid outcome for a pilot does not work. That's absolutely, thank you. I mean, people talk a good game about, if I hear Edison quoted one more time about, I didn't, figure it out one time, I failed. Okay, internalize that though, right? He's saying failure is good, that try and figure it out. And we don't really internalize that as orgs and as teams when we think about innovation. If you talk to a VC, a venture capital firm, The difference between being right 8% of the time and being right 10% of the time is you picked Uber,
Right.
or you invested in Amazon,
Right.
or you invested in Facebook. That's the difference, right? It's thin. And the only way you get there is by trying a lot of stuff.
Mm-hmm.
You just got to try a lot of stuff. I can't tell you the number of things that Amazon has failed at. It's legion.
Because they'd kill you, or you could tell us.
No. I mean, we don't have the time for me to run down the list of things we've tried and not continued. Right.
And people would love to get their hand on your dossier of failure, right? Just so they could pick up the scraps and go, maybe we can fix it.
It's public. We tried some huge things, but there's also one of my favorite stories is about, 2 years ago, we had a person working in our AWS data center and they wanted to restart a server. And so they mistyped the command. Instead of restarting the server, they restarted the data center and took a lot of the internet offline for a little bit. It's fine. We got it back. The reaction, though, was not fire that idiot. The reaction was, how could we have been so negligent that we created a system that allowed a typo to do that, that it should have caught it? And so you remove that fear. Plus, you never want to fire that person because they're going to be the least likely person to ever make another mistake the rest of their career. But that fear of trying things has got to be something that companies build into their culture. And employees have to know that they can trust their company to not look at a failed pilot or a pilot that doesn't go forward. I don't like to say failed. A pilot that doesn't go forward for whatever reason might not be the right time. That's great. That's awesome. Maybe you just saved us 4 years of work that wouldn't go anywhere.
So much a part of this fail fast and break things culture of Facebook and other companies in Silicon Valley, right? That purport that oftentimes don't take responsibility for that which they break, right?
Sure.
So one is to get also, I think it's a really good conversation about failure and the very real consequences internally of that, right? I mean, It's not to say it's not impacting your personal reputation, but the storytelling that happens around failure is such a part of that culture. And so at Amazon, do you go back to that press release, that initial press release, and say, where was our premise wrong? Where was our thinking wrong? Because it felt like we got it so right.
Right. We actually have postmortem tools to look at things afterwards. We have cause of errors, COEs in case something actually breaks. But I'll say this, that when it comes to fielding a pilot that's actually going to involve customers. So if you're actually going to touch a customer with this pilot, that's the biggest hurdle to get past. You have to do the most work to assure your chain of command that we are doing everything possible to kind of minimize any downside impact on the customer here. Like they're aware they're in a pilot. They're aware that this product may or may not go forward. We give them all the kinds of information that we're trying this. And then we do everything to continuously protect data and work on those fronts to make sure that if we ever do a pilot that involves customers, that they are the most protected people that we have, right? If it's so much easier to field an internal pilot that's just touching the Amazonians than it is one that goes external and touches customers. So we're very, very aware and cognizant of that. And I don't think anybody should back away from that. In fact, I think if you look overall at the kind of move fast and break things modality, I think there's been an unspoken caveat emptor on the part of the company saying, well, if they're using our product, they should just be aware that stuff could break or that we might expose 500 million people's personal data. And I don't think that's fair. So we go out of our way to make sure that any potential downside is known up front. It's that customer obsession, right? So it drills down to how you interview people. We look at every person who comes in for an interview as probably they're already a customer. And the last thing you want to do is create this cycle of interviewing people that gets rid of customers because they have a bad experience. So it's right. It's things like that we really pay attention to.
That's fascinating. So I would love to pose that to my listeners and say, have you ever considered that the people who are coming in, right, for a job interview are probably already a customer? And I actually worked with a client who they had a mobile comms platform, recognizing that most of their employees were on the phone, were on their cell phone. And between your acceptance for an interview and the time you came for the interview, you were fed coupons along the way for a discount at Ann Taylor Loft or, any of the other companies within that group. So half of it was just getting the interviewee to put on that Ann Taylor suit for the job interview. So at least over one more suit in.
Right.
At least you made one sale on the way into the job interview.
That's a really interesting proposition, is to start drawing them in closer as customers through the interview process. Yeah.
From recruitment to retirement.
Yeah, exactly.
So let me ask you this. So you've worked on the Amazon side of life, right? And you were there for a long time, and now you're on the AWS side.
Right.
And so what is the distinction, or is there a distinction in the culture going from something that, although, you're looking on the inside of the company, but is there a difference of being an innovation success manager at a consumer facing company versus a B2B facing company?
Well, I'd say AWS is also consumer facing. We have one of our buildings is called Low Flying Hawk. We name all of our buildings after things. And so in the early days of AWS, there was somebody who was a consistent commenter on our boards about our products and services, and not a troll, just genuinely passionate. External. They were a customer, and they weren't a troll. They were just genuinely interested and passionate about commenting on the stuff. And somebody finally looked up their average AWS monthly bill, and it was like $5, but their username was Low Flying Hawk. And so we actually have a building named after customer, a B2C customer of AWS. So I would say that, AWS is definitely customer facing. So in one sense, I don't think there's not a big shift going from kind of the CDO side and to AWS. I think the changes that you find within Amazon depend on kind of what you're working on and the focus of your team. So if you work on an operationally deployed team, so let's say you work on last mile logistics, or if you work on AWS teams that maintain our data centers, that operational focus is intense. And I think you find a different environment there than you'd find in our kind of L&D space. That's a different rhythm. Same thing if you work in channel retail. Your holidays are kind of shot because you work in retail and it's the holidays. And the holidays start in August and they run through January. So I think it really depends on, and Prime Air has a different rhythm than other things. And so...
Oh, that's right. You guys own an airline.
We lease airplanes and we deliver packages to our customers. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
So yeah, I think it depends on what group you're in and the focus that you have. Yeah. You don't feel a change going from the .com side to AWS side, not in that sense.
So we've heard, part of innovation lore, right? Because this is called innovation storytellers,
right?
Is learning about the advent of AWS as an internal program initially, right? To satisfy the need of Amazon and its growth. Can you just briefly share that AWS story, how it actually came to be?
You basically just said it, right? So what I think is interesting is this is a dynamic that's repeated across Amazon in multiple ways, is that prior to AWS, we're not the first company to ever stand up virtual machines. We realized early on that when we were scaling, we would have to do this internally to better serve our customers with more reliable service and to be able to drive our flywheel, which includes driving prices down on things. We needed to control more of the chain. And so it became a really logical decision to start building this internal capability. And then once we got good at it, it became really logical to think about, well, if we need this, other companies need this, other people need this. And then I think what kicked in was the customer obsession part of the flywheel, which said, well, then let's start really thinking deeply about what they actually need. And let's start driving the development of services. So on a typical year, typical kind of a misnomer, but AWS, I would say, fields probably 1,500 new services. Those range from the really small to the really big. And so
1,500 new services, meaning rolling out 1,500 new quote unquote innovations throughout this year?
Yeah. And to be clear, some of those can be really small tweaks to existing things.
Got it.
And some of them are like the release of Lex, AWS ML service that can analyze unstructured text data. Cool. Not minor, right? Nice. But so I think that drive to understand our customers and to continually innovate on their behalf is what's unique. We didn't invent virtual machines. We didn't invent selling things online, but it's that focus on what's the innovative part is keeping that customer as a laser focus. What's similar between Amazon and the Pentagon, and I know that opens up to all kinds of things, but in the Pentagon, when you really wanted to get down to the point of what you were doing, you would either be asked or have to ask, how does this benefit the warfighter? Like, how does this benefit the soldier, sailor, airman, and Marine who is going in harm's way for this nation? And does it help or hurt him or her? Right. And in the same way at Amazon, we ask that about the customer. Is what we're doing here going to be a benefit to the customer ultimately? And does it drive our flywheel to be able to provide greater selection, lower prices, better selection, lower prices, right? And so I think that's the focus is what's really innovative, because that's what's really hard. People want to think that it's a new process or a new technology that you can put in place, or that if you just start doing peer FAQs in your company, things will be really innovative. Might be true. But what also needs to happen is you need to have the doc read after the peer FAQ. You need to have the culture that says it's okay to take criticism of an idea and not make it personal. It's okay to fail or to have a pilot that doesn't go forward. There are all these kinds of cultural pieces that provide the context for doing these things that I think are the real innovation. And I think that's what Jeff and Andy and the other Jeff and the early kind of founders of Amazon really brought forward, was that relentless focus. And so I think that's what I don't want people who are involved in innovation to be able to appreciate the larger context and culture that you have to operate in and how that can impact what you're trying to do. Right. I hate to see good ideas go by the way because someone crossed a burning desert to give it back to you. Right.
This is why this show exists. It's the reason I started this show is how can we learn how to, from one another, from fellow innovators, to begin to think about how we make life better for the innovator, but also to learn from one another about what are the pieces that need to be there. And this North Star that Amazon shines for a lot of us, the customer experience, the relentless focus on customer experience is something that all of us probably need to do a little bit more thinking about. So I want to ask you a couple of questions. These are my 3 hot seat questions for every person who comes on Innovation Storytellers. So in your experience, what you have seen in your world, your favorite innovation, not that you've worked on, but your favorite innovation of all time, if you had to look around the world and say, God, what a game changer. Or, I just love this tiny little thing that makes life better, or whatever it may be. What is that thing?
Okay, so I'm a relentless academic, right? So Roy Amara, who is president of the Institute for the Future, said that we overestimate the impact of a technology in the short run and we underestimate its impact in the long run. And so for me, the thing that kind of 2 things symbolize that. One, my grandchildren are going to grow up wondering that Amazon ever sold books.
What's a book?
That's going to be an after, right? Where I thought they just ran the internet. The other thing is I don't think I can begin to discount at all the genius that is the smartphone, the iPhone, the thing that kind of kicked it off. I think when I look at it, the compute power, the things it enabled, that it's with us. I mean, from an anthropological standpoint, it's this iconography that's with us, that lives with us. There are very few things that live on our body like that are so packed with capabilities. And so for me, I just can't get away from it. So,
and I would add that we add so much of ourselves to so freely. So we water it more than any house plant, right? We're constantly giving it more fodder for whatever it is doing in there.
Right. And so there's all kinds of things I can draw out of this, which is you look at studies on the extension of consciousness, that this is really our tap into a network beyond us for most of us, right? Mm-hmm. So that shift from, I'm old enough to have gone from desktop to primitive laptop to Motorola StarTAC. I had an HP iPac that had a mechanical hard drive to my iPhone. So I think that one's just stunning, really. Game changer. Absolutely.
And the most exciting innovation that you have worked on, your favorite innovation that you've worked on?
So the enterprise-wide ideation programs at Amazon were kind of a fulfillment of something that I constantly dream about. So even I worked at Booz Allen in Washington, D.C., in 3 buildings with about 20,000 of the smartest people I've ever encountered. And
you said you worked at the Pentagon, right? Just to clarify, I just want to make sure you're setting these boundaries up.
So I've been a defense contractor and a federal employee. So I've worked in Mark can't stay in one place. But one of the things that always fascinated me was, here are all these people. We have all these things that we're working on for our clients. What if we could all just focus on one thing for 15 minutes? And you get 20,000 people to focus on one thing for 15 minutes. and you could create some extraordinary ideas. And so figuring out at Amazon how you got, and I would say we made a really good try, but we learned so much about what we didn't know about how you do that at scale. But the thing that I'm really proud of is that we fielded this program to surface think big ideas, and we did it earnestly. We were actually asking people for big ideas, like no kidding. Like if you have your process improvement idea, I don't want it. I want the next AWS. I want the next Prime, Air, whatever. And we asked it in all earnestness, and we stayed customer obsessed. So we tried to give people a really good experience, even though 99.9% of the people submitting ideas were not going to have their idea move forward. How do you provide a good customer experience in that environment? And so I'm really proud of the effort that we put into doing that.
Mm. And I'll have to have you back to learn what came out of that, if you're able to share those top secret ideas that are going to be floating around.
I'm trying to write the book, right? So yeah, it's just a whole lot.
Yeah. And the last question is, if you could participate, right? If you could participate in an innovation program, the inception of, insert, fill in the blank there, what would that be? Or work with an innovator, right? Someone who you would have loved to have worked with or would love to work with on the innovation side.
So this one's kind of easy. Doug Engelbart, the mother of all demos, the guy who created the mouse. Xerox PARC, if I could go any place at any time, I would embed myself at Xerox PARC in the early 70s to early 80s. So much of what we take for granted now. I sat down at a table one time at a conference, and this guy sat down across from me, and he had his name tag on it, said Bob Kahn. And I looked at him, I said, "Are you the Bob Kahn?" And he said, "If you mean the guy who also worked with Vint Cerf, then yes, I am." And I'm sitting there talking to the co-creator of TCP/IP, which how many people don't even know what that is now?
Right.
And it's the backbone of all of this, right? So if I could go back, I would sit there and be there at the birth of ARPANET, or be over at CERN and be a friend of Tim Berners-Lee when he was drawing the mesh on the napkin, right? I mean, Bob Kahn said he used to walk around with an index card in his pocket that had all the IP addresses on it. And he meant in the world.
Right.
In the world. And to kind of be there at that moment of creation, there's no other place. To have seen what happened there, to be there at the birth of things like the Well, the Whole Earth Catalog, to be there with Tim O'Reilly and people who were founders of this, like not the first one, that was kind of lame, but like the third Burning Man, right? When it finally made it out to the playa and was on Black Rock Mesa. Wow, that was amazing. And I don't know if that's cyclical, if we get back to that place where technologies that were accepted at that time were like TV and the telephone. I don't know how we get to a place where so much of that becomes embedded in our environment that we can become so wide-eyed and awestruck again by the things that we're creating, but that's definitely where I would go.
Yeah. To like the face of a little kid blowing bubbles for the first time. Right.
Oh my God. Can you imagine when they're just sitting around talking about this stuff? It would just mind-blowing. And no one knew what the hell was going on. No one knew what they were creating. Yeah, if you're asking an anthropologist and a historian where you could go back and like be the time traveler and be the invisible observer and just, yeah, that's it. No question.
Well, I think we're going to get a lot of comments on this because I'm going to continue to ask, my listeners,
awesome.
Who would you want to be innovating with? If you could choose anyone, right, to sit down at a bench with or sit down next to at the computer and bring a box of donuts with you,
right?
Who would that be?
That would be awesome.
Mark, I can't thank you enough. So if people want to get in touch with you and help commiserate on your future book on this very specific topic,
right.
What's the best way for people to get in touch with you? How would you like people to reach out to you?
Yeah, probably the best way is Twitter, to be honest. So it's MOEHLERT, super, original handle, first initial, last name. But yeah, that's probably the best place to reach out.
Got you. So you're Mo-lert. And,
yes.
And you're Mo-alert and a lot of other people. So we appreciate it.
Right.
Great. So
nice.
We'll put all that in the show notes for our listeners. And Mark, thank you so much. One armchair anthropologist to another. It's great to have you on. Thank you.
Yep. Thanks, Susan.
This innovation story has ended, but yours is just beginning. Go to innovationstorytellers.com, download the free Innovation Storytelling Blueprint, and sign up to pre-order Susan's book, Innovation Storytelling. Get the resources, runway, and recognition you deserve due out this spring. Remember to subscribe so you don't miss an episode. Until the next innovation story.